Serial Experiments Lain is one of those animes that current audiences unfortunately get wrong. Though the first half of the series is meandering and cryptic, the second half becomes deceptively straightforward as we learn more about Lain, the secret plot behind the Knights of Eastern Calculus, and Protocol 7's human instrumentality-like implementation. By the end of the series, Lain is rhetorically deemed a goddess with near omnipotence over humanity. But the implications the audience of the 90s understood couldn't be any more different than today's interpretations of this series. You see, Lain isn't supposed to be seen as a god or savior, but rather, the apocalypse itself. The 90s were seen as a time of cynicism, particularly in Japan. After the Plaza Accord that depreciated the US dollar artificially, Japan's economic bubble of the late 1980s burst, and wages fell and property prices plummeted, causing an era of economic stagnation that lasts until today. These reverberations were most apparent during the late 90s, in which Japanese producer Yasuyuki Ueda felt that Japanese culture had been degraded by American values after World War II. After all, Japan had undergone an economic miracle, and as if through sabotage, the moment the Plaza Accord was agreed upon, Japan lost its status as the world's center of electronics and economic potential. Yasuyuki Ueda, perhaps, then saw the internet as an inescapable westernized product that had the potential to further infiltrate Japanese values. According to him, Serial Experiments Lain was meant to be a statement to instigate a culture war between Japan and the United States, thinking that American audiences would miss the message of Lain. It's interesting then, that when American critics held the same views as Japanese audiences, Yasuyuki Ueda admitted disappointment. It has been nearly 25 years since Serial Experiments Lain was first broadcasted, and in that time the internet has undergone massive changes, and with it, the world's opinions of its utility. You see, in 1998, the internet was quite useful for governments, militaries, and large corporations. But for the general population, the internet was seen as a Pandora's box of possibilities and dangers. Adoption was slow. For example, there were only 50,000 domains registered in Japan by 1998, showing us a low usage rate proportional to Japan's population. And yet, Serial Experiments Lain painted a completely different world. Even though to our eyes today, Serial Experiments Lain looks like a 90s representation of the internet, it was at the time cyberpunk, a dystopian future characterized by a society intrinsically reliant and addicted to the internet. Serial Experiments Lain was never a depiction of society. It was a what-if scenario that largely predicted everything correctly. From this scope, we can understand that The Wired was never supposed to be depicted as the everyday tool we are familiar with today. Rather, 90s audiences viewed The Wired with a morbid fascination about the grotesque levels of escapism this fictional society had. Surfing The Wired was not seen as we see it today as an integral part of everyday lives, but as a drug that distracted society from their miserable realities. But Serial Experiments Lain wasn't supposed to just show how degenerate society could become, but also offered a messiah, a true god that could offer a solution. This is where Arisu comes in. Arisu, or Alice, represents salvation in Serial Experiments Lain. Arisu is introduced in Layer 1 and is shown to have an interest in Lain. What's interesting about this is that it is implied that had Arisu shown the same level of interest in Chisu, Chisu wouldn't have committed suicide to begin with, because then she would have a life in the real world and would have to relinquish that for The Wired. But because Arisu showed interest in Lain, she introduced the conflict that Lain was to internally endure up until the end of the series. Arisu represents the real world, and ironically, she's the one who takes Lain to Siberia, which is a cybernetic-themed cafe, whereas Lain is drawn to a real-themed world that's cybernetic. Arisu's not only Lain's encouragement to get out more and experience the real world, but shows a genuine concern time and again over Lain every time she starts to slip away into a more dissociative state. Arisu, then, is the representation of the average 90s viewer, somebody who has used the internet before, but who is not a netizen. Arisu, then, can be seen as the good antagonist from the perspective that she's actively working against Lain's destiny to uncover the plot of the Knights of Eastern Calculus and to discover her own nature as a computer program. Obviously, near the end of the series, we discover that Masami Airi is the antagonist who is working towards the fulfillment of the Protocol 7 to become the god of humanity, but his values align more with Lain's than Arisu's. Arisu just wants her friends to feel genuinely cared for and able to be vulnerable around her, whereas both Lain and Airi want to be able to exist in a world of eternal escapism. I'll return to Arisu, but first let me explain how both Lain and Airi are the same character with minor differences. In Layer 1, before we are even introduced to the concept of the Wired, Knights, or the general nature of Lain, we see her spacing out in class and emitting weird smoke bands from her fingertips. Though this isn't meant to be taken as a real thing Lain is doing, it is quite intentional. It shows us that Lain is not interested in being a part of the real world, so to speak, and has dissociative tendencies, often living entirely in her head. We also see her blatantly ignore people when spoken to while not having any expression. This wasn't done by accident, nor to give it an aesthetic of mystery, but rather to show us that Lain isn't fully here. If we isolate the idea of the Wired and 90s skepticism of the emerging internet, we can assume then that Lain has a personality disorder and switches between being present and absent in the real world. According to Mayo Clinic, Lain most likely has dissociative identity disorder based on these descriptors that align with her symptoms. And I quote, "Dissociative identity disorder is characterized by switching to alternate identities. You may feel the presence of two or more people talking or living inside your head, and you may feel as though you're possessed by other identities. Each identity may have a unique name, personal history, and characteristics, including obvious differences in voice, gender, mannerisms, and even such physical qualities as the need for eyeglasses. There are also differences in how familiar each identity is with the others. People with dissociative identity disorder typically also have dissociative amnesia and often have dissociative fugue." If we assume then that Lain's strange behavior is an example of her mental illness, we can then understand Yasuyuki Ueda's thoughts about the early internet's potential, and by extension, 90s audiences around the world. For the most part, Lain's fugue personality seeks comfort on the internet and exists there, mainly acting as a force of destruction and harm, because the real world represents an existential threat to her. And though we see Lain's fugue personality in the real world, such as causing the shooter in Siberia to shoot himself in Layer 2, she is powerless against those who are not consumed by the Wired, such as Arisu, which is why she resorts to exposing her in Layer 8 in order to force a separation between the real world Lain and her. By the way, the reason Arisu is impervious to such manipulations is because she does not use the Wired as a form of escapism, but rather communication, meaning that she's always living in the real world. This difference is actually alluded by Lain's father when he says, "When it's all said and done, the Wired is just a medium of communication and the transfer of information. You mustn't confuse it with the real world. Do you understand what I'm warning you about?" With Lain, of course, retorting, "You're wrong." Now let's talk about how Irie is basically Lain. Masami Irie is one of the creators of Protocol 7, and once he was investigated and caught for adding his own consciousness into Protocol 7, he was fired and shortly after committed suicide. In Layer 13, we learn that his personality by default is one of an inferiority complex, hating his job and psyching himself up to quit. This gives us a better look into his desire for controlling Protocol 7 and becoming a god. In Layer 12, we realize why Irie wanted to upload his conscious into the Wired, by stating, "You can control the emotion by modifying the impulses of the brain. You can refuse unpleasant impulses. You can choose only pleasant and comfortable things." In saying this, he's basically admitting that the realities of the real world pushed him into having a life of hedonism in the Wired. Lain is no different, disregarding the realities of her own life and largely being absent from Arisu and her friends' escapades into the city, yet physically being with them. This means that ultimately the conflict between Irie and Lain isn't about the merits of reality against escapism, because both characters live and breathe escapism. Their conflict, rather, is about what to do with the power of escapism. While Irie wants to escape into a world where he can become the god of all humanity within Protocol 7, Lain learns that the responsibility of being a god bears no fruits, and that because she cannot live in the real world indefinitely, she needs to become the arbiter of reality. Evidence for this claim is how they both view the idea of becoming a god. Though Irie is very on the nose about his god complex, it's interesting how he reacts to the idea of being exposed as nothing more than a pretender who overtook power. When Lain says, "You were only a proxy god of someone who was waiting for the appearance of the Wired," Irie freaks out and starts yelling like a lunatic. Obviously, this means that the one thing that Irie is trying to escape is his insecurity through the Wired, and the moment he realizes he can be exposed as a loser despite being a god, he cracks and his entire bravado collapses. This theme isn't only explored with Irie, but also with members of the Knights, where some of them seem like competent members of society, and others appear to be modern culture's depiction of neckbeard losers. Lain's opinion of becoming a god, on the other hand, is one of denial. This is seen in Layer 13 when evil Lain tries to convince her of her own godhood, but good Lain continuously rejects this reality. You see, for good Lain, becoming a god is a source of responsibility, and based on what we know about Lain, responsibility is the burden of the real world. This leads me to talk about Lain and why her depiction was originally met from the angle of being a necessary evil, instead of being a heroine by today's standards. There is a subtle juxtaposition made in the series that is meant to make us realize that Lain is kind of a shitty person. Lain's interactions are predominantly one-sided, where she offers very little for other people and seems to demand things from others, albeit in a quiet Japanese middle schooler type of way, but she still does it. Her interactions with her father at the beginning of the series consist of her using him as a source of information, or whatever she needed at the moment. Though we may chalk up her manipulative nature as an aesthetic from the series, we're shown that same behavior from Miho Iwakura as a way to make us, the audience, react negatively to her seemingly apathetic nature towards her own daughters. Miho Iwakura is shown cooking and doing what's necessary to contribute to the Iwakura household, but her interactions with Mika and Lain are meant to make us hate her, especially when we see that her interactions are completely the opposite with Yasuo, Lain's father. It may seem that in the grand scheme of things, this behavior never has a payoff in the series, and therefore can be considered as a non-consequential quirk of Miho's personality. But when we compare Miho's reactions to having to speak with her family with Lain's reactions, we can see that they're identical. I mean it. The way Lain interacts with Mika at the beginning of the series is absolutely devoid of courtesy or concern, and vice versa, which is why Miho's character exists as a reflection of how Lain actually is. As we follow Lain's journey of self-discovery, we see her neglect her friends, family, and responsibilities, and realize that even though Lain has an evil side to her when she goes on fugue, her good side isn't necessarily good either. Lain is neutral at best for about 2/3 of the series, until she is betrayed by knights and realizes that she has to put a stop to their plot. This is why Lain realizes that the world of escapism is problematic in and of itself. It allows people to disregard consequences and to escape uncomfortable realities, but despite her realization, she decides that she can't live in the real world, and she ultimately loses the fight against the Wired. Proof that Lain was destroyed by the Wired, much like Irie was, comes in Layer 12 when Arisu fearfully tries to rescue Lain from completely disappearing. She tells Lain, "Your body is so cold, but alive. Mine is also." Here, and grounds Lain by making her react to her heartbeat. This scene is literally a depiction of dissociative coping. By making Lain say doki doki to Arisu's heartbeat, she's attempting to get Lain to come back to the real world and snap out of her fugue state. This action alone means both symbolically and literally that Arisu was Lain's link to the real world, and by later resetting the world in Layer 13, Lain lost the fight against the Wired and let her fugue state win. We get our evidence regarding this when Arisu says the following in regards to the vestiges of her trauma disappearing. She states, "It has never happened if there is no memory," before her mind resets completely and she goes on to live her normal life. What's interesting about this phrase is that it relates to God's existence, and by extension, Lain's destruction of both the material world and her own existence. You see, if nobody remembers Lain, she never existed, and if Lain never existed, then there is no God. Basically, a god without anybody to acknowledge it is merely a force of nature, and by extension, can't be God. This shows us that Lain could have won in the end, but that is not what Ueda wanted us to interpret. You see, beating Irie and winning were not mutually exclusive, because in the end Lain did in fact beat Irie and ended his apotheosis. But instead of replacing him, or better yet, living in the real world, Lain realized that her existence was incompatible with reality. She realized that she could not pick up the pieces of her own wake of destruction and live with the reality that people are forced to live every single day of their lives, but rather restart the world, and in doing so, avoiding the real responsibilities of her actions. Even if Arisu had to live with her secret exposed to the world, she would still find happiness and move on with her life. And similar to her, the world would do what it always did and bounce back for the better. And as for Lain, instead of being the destroyer of the real world, she would have to own up to what she did and learn to rebuild her friendships one step at a time, and eventually learn to become human. You see, this is what audiences actually saw in 1998, a futuristic version of the internet where the idea of losing one's own life in the vastness of the web was tangible and easy to understand. Perhaps we can understand this idea too, but the reality is, we're already lost. I mean, think about it. We're already living in the world of the Wired, where social media is our persona, where through anonymity we become different people with different morals, where instead of dealing with our emotions, we vent onto forums. And whenever we do something regrettable, we delete it. So even if Lain was a program meant to connect the world, she didn't need the Wired to fulfill her mission. In fact, the world was always connected. She just needed a little bit of grounding. But the fact that Lain had to manually reset the world instead of dealing with the consequences of her reality didn't make her a goddess, but rather the end of the real world and the birth of Protocol 7.